desk at which he'd been writing, and he began to wonder if he might be dizzy. The room seemed to be in motion. The mirror and other items suspended from the walls and ceilings were moving. Many days later, he learned what caused those things was something that had happened more than 1,000 miles away in Missouri, an event that has been called the worst earthquake in recorded history. The weather was clear, quiet, the night of December 15, 1811 in New Madrid. Early in the morning of the 16th, about 2:30 a.m., individuals living in the New Madrid area were awakened by loud cracking and popping noises. Their houses began to creak, and unsupported structures like chimneys began to fall. The household furniture was being thrown about as the fearful inhabitants ran outside to escape the falling debris. Many of them stayed outside, shivering in the night air as aftershocks continued to terrorize them and make their houses unsafe to return to. Daylight brought more tremors and more shocks, some as severe as the first initial shock. Shocks continued throughout the entire day of December 16th and into December 17th. After the nightmare of the earthquake, area inhabitants seeking shelter in what buildings were still standing, or making do with what shelter was available and away, they thought, from the danger, often were left homeless again when the new tremors destroyed what was left of the buildings. But as the smaller tremors continued, people became accustomed to them, and life returned to business as usual as the shocks gradually subsided. But farmers, returning to their fields, found many changes in the landscape they had worked so diligently to raise crops on. The earthquake and following aftershocks caused a phenomenon known as sand blows or sand boils, as well as ground fissures, numerous landslides, and raising or falling of the ground surface, in some cases as much as 15 feet. River and creek beds had changed their paths. Water suddenly pooled in lakes where only dry land had been before. It wasn't just the dry land that was affected during the more intense tremors. The Mississippi riverbed lifted and dropped, causing permanent changes like currents and whirlpools, waterfalls. The entire channel changed, wiping out the original site of New Madrid. The swampy bayou was uplifted and dried out. Other land dropped and created lakes like Flag Lake near Canada and across the river Reelfoot Lake. The effect of the earthquakes was not restricted to just the New Madrid area. Virtually the entire North American continent had experienced some type of shaking or tremoring during the earthquake. Reports from as far north as Upper Canada and the Great Lakes region, south to New Orleans, and east to Cincinnati, Boston, and Baltimore all told of buildings shaking and swaying, chandeliers, plates, and glass breaking. Tremors were felt in Upper Canada by the Indians on the Upper Missouri. Residents of New Orleans, Detroit, Washington, Boston, Cincinnati, and elsewhere felt it. In Charleston, West Virginia, the tremors were strong enough to ring church bells. In Carthage, Tennessee, residents felt one or more shocks for 2 weeks each day, including one on January 1st, 1812, that cracked the courthouse foundation. In Natchez, Mississippi, walls cracked, clocks stopped. In Piney River, Tennessee, 20 acres of land dropped until the tops of trees were level with the surrounding ground. Although property destruction was widespread, few individuals lost their lives during the earthquakes. This is due to two factors. The area was sparsely populated, so few individuals and buildings were in the area. Most buildings and homes in the area were of wood construction. So although walls did collapse, the danger and harm was not as severe as that of buildings constructed with larger stone or brick. The fatalities that did occur were mostly near the riverbanks, when people were swept away or buried by landslides, and boats were swamped or destroyed by a river full of uprooted trees. One woman, terrified by the events, ran for safety and finally died of fear and exhaustion. Every house in the town of 800 persons was down, but only a few other fatalities were reported because the area was sparsely settled. In 1811, there were no news cameras, no newspaper photographers, no satellites to report live on the scene action. In fact, few scientifically trained individuals were in the United States, much less in the primitive region around New Madrid during the earthquakes. Instead, verbal reports from untrained observers were collected by reporters for newspapers, and inhabitants wrote to eyewitness accounts about their experiences, often in letters to faraway relatives. Scholars of the time did attempt to compile as much data as possible, but they had no idea of how to explain the earthquake. In 1912, Myron L. Fuller, New Madrid's seismic zone historian, collected these field surveys, these personal accounts, historical and scientific reports about the quakes, and published them in the Bulletin for the U.S. Geological Survey, almost 100 years after the events. From his works, we can imagine the panic the inhabitants felt on that cold December night. The ground rose and fell as earth waves, like the long, low swell of the sea, passed along its surface tilting the trees until their branches interlocked and opening the soil in deep cracks as the surface was bent. Fuller also included the accounts of English scientist John Bradbury, who happened to be traveling south to New Orleans on a keelboat. He stopped at New Madrid on the 14th and had worked his way downstream to a small town called Little Prairie, the area that is now Carruthersville. He tied up on a small island in the river. At 2 a.m., Bradbury and the rest of his party were awakened by a rumbling sound and choppy waters. They looked out at the island just in time to see a chasm about 80 yards long and 4 feet wide open up. By daylight, he had counted 27 shocks, and around him, the earth was going crazy. Fuller's information is still used as a starting point for many historians and scientists investigating the New Madrid earthquakes. His book was the first systematic attempt to compile a comprehensive scientific account of the events 100 years before. These accounts and records have been analyzed and have allowed the reconstruction of the events by modern scientists. Through their studies, scientists have been able to develop a scientific hypothesis about the reasons and factors which led to the earthquake events of 1811 and 12 in southeastern Missouri. Even though it is an admirable work, there were some discrepancies which Mr. Fuller was unable to clear up. Dr. Otto Nutley utilized Fuller's work to define the scope and the intensity of the New Madrid earthquake events, giving us a timeline charting the date and intensity of more than 2,000 earthquakes and aftershocks occurring between December 16, 1811, and March of 1812. But even as modern scientists close in on the causes and contributing factors to the 1811 and 12 phenomena, much is still unknown.